I am Judy Stewart. I lead the US vaccines team here at GSK. I'm going to have the rest of the panel members introduce themselves in a minute, but we're going to kick off with our first question, which we were asked to have a think about what is the most lasting change we think we will see in the vaccine space due to the disruption that we've all experienced over the last 2 years with COVID. So I will start with that. I actually am quite hopeful about some of the change that I think we will see, hopefully last. There's three things really for me that jump out. One is the speed with which we brought things to market as an industry and as an entire system, health system, ecosystem. The second is around the collaborations that we saw spring up from the pandemic. And I think the third, which is probably where I'm most hopeful, doesn't change, is people's perception of the importance of prevention and taking care of our health and being vaccinated. And so consumer perception is one that I'm super hopeful doesn't change as we move past the pandemic. So I will turn it over for introductions and to answer the question to my esteemed colleagues.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judy. My name is Lovisa Afzelius, background in computational chemistry, and I've been in pharma for the past 20 years or so. About 4 years ago, I moved into the startup world and joined Flagship Pioneering's ecosystem, and I'm currently an Origination partner with Flagship Pioneering. So if I think about what I believe are the most lasting changes resulting from the disruption of vaccine value chain, as Judy alluded to, I agree with all the things that Judy said. And in addition, I think that what it was is a real showcasing of the power of innovation. And I think our society in general has just yielded a much deeper and a much sort of broader understanding of the power of scientific innovation and how it can create an unprecedented change in a very short period of time, and how these step changes can completely change our current paradigm for drug development. So to the point that also Judy made, we can start challenging the dogma around the length of therapeutic development, of regulatory frameworks, of timelines, etc. So in the future, we may be saying that we're putting a COVID lens to everything that we do in order to make the impossible seem possible. But then secondly, I think what we've also seen is the introduction of a new modality in the context of RNA that I think will change the paradigm of how we're thinking about therapeutics and prophylactics, similar to what antibodies did over 20 years ago. And we will see many new RNA therapeutics. We have seen mRNA, we'll see endless RNA, we see transfer RNA, tRNA, that are actually building all of the foundation created by RNA as bioplatform companies. And this is an area that, for example, Flagship has been invested in over a decade. We're even launching a company in that sense today, Alterna. And it kind of brings me to my final point, which is that these types of disruptions that we've seen in the vaccine value chain, I think they will only be repeated in the future if we have digitalized frameworks to what we're doing, so that we create more programmable therapeutics that can be instantly deployed. And I think that digitalized code is a profound feature of many of the up and coming RNA modalities, which they may be. And with that, I leave the word to you, Nelly, please.
Great, thank you. I'm Nell Beattie, Chief Business Officer of VBI Vaccines. And just briefly, VBI is a public biotech company with a pipeline of infectious disease and immuno-oncology candidates. We actually, our lead candidate, a 3-antigen prophylactic hepatitis B vaccine, for which I'm leading the sales and marketing effort, is under review by the FDA and the European Medicines Agency, so we're right in the thick of it all. Our other lead programs include immunotherapeutic candidates in development for the treatment of hepatitis B, and glioblastoma, brain cancer, and then a suite of coronavirus and COVID-19 vaccine candidates. And our goal with these COVID-19 candidates is not to chase variants. I mean, we do not believe that that would be an effective strategy, but to develop vaccine candidates capable of eliciting broad immune response to help protect against known and emerging variants of COVID-19. And I think in response to the question, and probably very similar to Judy's answer, but I mean, the last 2 years have been a time of incredible disruption. And with the pandemic having severe global public health, societal, economic consequence. But I hope one of the lasting impacts would be that renewed interest and focus on vaccines. That vaccines were not seen as a hot area for investors to focus, or vaccine development and commercialization was consolidated into a handful of companies. In these last 2 years, we've seen unprecedented collaboration across industry, governments, NGOs, public health. We've seen renewed appreciation from the general public, prioritization that I hope will carry over into other adult vaccinations. And we've seen some impressive innovation come from biotech and pharma companies really across the range of market cap. So, I mean, given the public health benefit and the health economics argument of vaccines, I think and I hope that this momentum stays for a while. And I know we'll dig into all of this more. So looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for inviting me to participate in the panel.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's hard without a moderator. Hi, I'm Rasmus. I'm the CEO of Airfinity, a science analytics company that works very much in the COVID and also broader infectious disease space. And I will just I think there's 2 points for me. I think I agree with everything that's been said and don't want to repeat it, but what's the kind of final outcome of this? I think it is we will see much better vaccines. We'll see much faster vaccines coming much faster to market than we have so far. I think it's fair to say that the vaccine market pre-COVID wasn't the most exciting space. I think we gotten used to, if you take the flu market, for instance, we've gotten used to vaccines that maybe had like 50% efficacy, sometimes lower. We've gotten used to fairly long production times. That was just the accepted standard. Now we see what's possible. COVID has showed us what is actually possible in terms of how fast we can develop vaccines, but also the efficacy levels that we can aim for. And I think that really will transform things, but it will also set expectations higher, I think, both for end users, but also for government buyers. And so that's kind of one thing. I think the other really important thing is that the money and the demand side of vaccines has been completely transformed, right? We're looking at a COVID market of 60 to 70 billion this year, estimated to more than 100 billion next year, compared to like a flu market that may be 6-7 billion. So there's just a level of investment coming from primarily governments as a kind of insurance policy, and I don't think that's going to go away. I think if we're looking just like indicators we have from the flu market, we saw Sanofi's numbers in Europe like up 80% revenue this year alone. We're seeing basically countries across the board investing more heavily in other vaccine areas than not just COVID. And the real reason for that is that the cost of the pandemic of like 5 trillion a year is just so big that even if we as a society are going to spend 100 billion, it's peanuts compared to the cost of the pandemic. So I think the whole risk calculation has changed, and that will lead to a continued inflow of investment from especially governments around the world.
Great. So I think the first question that was slated to be asked to us was, what has the pandemic taught us about how to support vaccine development and access in an emergency?
Judy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure, I can start. I think we briefly touched on it in the introductions. I think one of the things for sure is around collaboration. So maybe we can start the discussion there. I think you've seen a ton of collaboration happening amongst quite a few partners that you maybe wouldn't normally have seen. For us, we've partnered with CureVac for technology's sake. We've partnered with Sanofi to try to leverage both our know-how on proteins and adjuvants together. I think there's been lots of collaboration, as Rasmus said, around working with governments. Each of them take on a different flavor, depending on what country you're talking about. But I think, there's just been a ton of collaboration, and I'm sure, you've all seen it from your perspectives as well. So I would say, that is a big one for me that I think we need to figure out how to do more of.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think to be successful, we really need kind of all hands on deck and kind of across that value chain. I think obviously the vanguard companies to develop the first COVID-19 vaccines to get the pandemic under control. I mean, through government, NGO funding, collaboration with the regulatory bodies, especially at a time when, I mean, our understanding of the virus is changing at such a rapid pace. I mean, they were able to develop these effective and safe vaccines in a really very fast way. But then we also saw kind of the alignment and cooperation across all bodies to roll out vaccine recommendations, distribute and administer the vaccine. I do think the process highlighted some infrastructure, manufacturing, and access weak spots. I think it also identified the need to continue to invest in innovation for that next generation of vaccines, where the first wave of COVID-19 vaccines were critical to get the pandemic under control. But they may not be the best vaccines for the long-term management of the virus, understanding the kind of mutational evolution of the virus. So I think these areas have all been places where investment has occurred since kind of that beginning part of the pandemic, and hopefully that will continue to be so.
And I can just add to that as to, I think the other piece in this is also that preparedness is really key. I think that's what we also learned during this course. If we look back, like every year over the past 10 years, every year there has been an outbreak that could just as well led to another pandemic. So I think what we need to, if for example, the infectivity being a little bit different or case fatality rate being a little bit different. So I think that, I mean, this pandemic, it was predicted and it could have been prevented. So I think we should prepare ourselves much more for the future, similar to how we think about investing in, for example, military systems in order to protect ourselves. We should also protect ourselves similarly when it comes to our health. And how can we build more of a global pathogen shield, something that includes systems of early warning and detection, instant protection, but also deep immune monitoring to understand and optimize the protection that we're moving forward. Rasmus, any additional comments?
I think that's a great point, and I think the collaboration is. I think we've really seen the importance of the role of the state in the pandemic, right? That states have stepped in, helped invest early in innovation and in production across the value chain. We've also seen a lot of challenges for states to collaborate amongst each other. We've seen COVAX, which was actually, in some ways a beautiful idea, right, with a centralized purchase system that could, be distributed. That hasn't worked out very well, because in the end, a lot of countries then chose, and you can argue rightly, to protect their own citizens first, right? So I think we now maybe have a more realistic understanding of what kind of collaboration is possible and what is not possible. And I think some of your points, Louisa, on data sharing, that's one area where we definitely can see everyone wins, right? If we need to know about the new mutations as soon as they emerge, we need to know about what is the production capacity around the world, because if we don't know that, we can't plan our vaccination programs. So some of those things, I think it's obvious for everyone that transparency, collaboration is really important. But we also need to let every country kind of protect its citizens. We need to let the individual companies invest and pursue what's best. I mean, I think we still have like more than 300 candidates in COVID, right? It's only a few of them that have succeeded. So there's always a lot of focus on the successful ones, but we should not forget that there's also been a lot of investment going in that hasn't yielded any returns.
So another question.
I think. Please go ahead.
I
was just going to add
the question.
To say. No, go ahead. Go ahead. All set.
All right. So I was just moving us on to the next question, which we talked about before, which is what has been the impact of these last 20 months of vaccines and treatments for various cancers and other infectious diseases, and what can we expect to see with regard to continuous innovation? And maybe Nell, you want to start there?
Sure. So I mentioned earlier kind of about the next generation of COVID vaccines, and how, I mean, again, the first wave of the COVID vaccines designed against the original Wuhan strain of COVID-19 were incredibly critical to be able to get ourselves out of this pandemic. But again, given that mutational evolution of COVID-19 for the long-term management of the virus, I mean, that next generation of vaccines really do need to confer a broader range of protection against, again, known and unknown emerging variants of COVID-19 and other beta coronaviruses. So actually, as part of that effort, I mean, we are assessing the potential for kind of boosters expressing the spike protein of a different variant from kind of the original Wuhan strain, where you had kind of had the prime with the original Vanguard group of vaccines, and then boost with a different vaccine that expresses a spike protein from the other variant. In this case, we're testing the beta variant, but also looking at multivalent candidates, ones that express a number of different spike proteins against SARS, MERS, and COVID-19. Again, with the thought that if you can protect against all three of those, well, you should be able to protect against kind of the variants between kind of the conformations of those three spike proteins as well. So again, while the last 20 months, I mean, they have shown us the approach to get a pandemic under control is very important to get the vaccines out quickly, but that innovation and support to continue that development and make sure that the companies developing the next wave of vaccines have kind of access to raw materials, to reagents, to kind of the whole spectrum on the supply chain, and have continued support from all of the collaborators who were part of the first kind of wave. I think that will be really important.
I mean, I think one of the other challenges that I think we're going to be facing, and you can kind of see it now, is that no one can completely predict what's going to happen with COVID, right? I think there's a couple of different scenarios that could play out, but I think one of the things that we're seeing is that whether it's retailers or healthcare professionals or even consumers, there's only so much they can do in a flu season or in a short period of time. And so I think figuring out a steady state of what is it going to look like from an innovation standpoint to make sure that everyone gets the vaccinations that they need as an adult. And those are just keep increasing, right? We've got more things in the pipeline, as Nell said, and I think figuring out how to combine some of those using the newer technologies is going to be critical in order to make sure that we keep the immunization rates for each individual vaccine up. I think a possible solution to that is combination vaccines. And so I think that is something that we're just going to have to be conscious of. We do it very well in the pediatric space within our markets, but we don't do as good a job as adults getting all the vaccinations that we need. And as more come, I think combination is going to be an innovation that is going to become critical.
Yeah, and if I was to address that, I see there's also an interesting question from the regarding vaccine delivery, and I think that it's a really good point that we have seen the production miracle, the science miracle, but we haven't seen a similar, in my view, distribution miracle, right? We're still seeing a lot of countries facing problems. Kind of how do we get the vaccines out to the end patient, right? And in some ways, you can say that the first COVID vaccine wave was somewhat easy, right? You had one vaccine and you just need to get everyone enrolled, right? Now we get to more complicated already booster, where you have to look at how many months since you had the last vaccine, and that already gets more complicated. And we can see many countries are struggling with that. And then to your both Nell and Judy's point, if we then have a situation where we have different types of vaccines to different variants. I mean, right now the Delta variant is kind of dominating completely, but say we had two variants that was the same transmission rates, right? Then we could have different regions with different variants, and even regionally, and then you look at a very complicated distribution system where you're sending some vaccines to some areas and some to others. And I would love to see much more investment in that area as well, not actually only for low and middle income countries, but also for high income.
Yeah, and I would add to that, I think moving towards variant-proof vaccines is going to be very, very important. I think it's really hard to predict what's going to happen exactly. So, at least in one of the efforts, FL77, that we're pursuing, we're thinking much more as to, out of all the possible variants that could happen, which would be the ones that we really truly need to protect ourselves towards by using tools like artificial intelligence to map out the entire space, and then start to understand what is that antibody repertoire that you need to have to be protected towards any and all future variants, and really work towards building variant-proof vaccines towards those most infectious, for example, variants. And I mean, in general, vaccines across not just infectious diseases, but also other diseases are really important and the best preemptive treatments, I would say, across all areas of applicability. And now we see Greg.
Yes, speaking of disruptive technologies, apologies everyone for the wildly unforeseen technical issues. Welcome. Anyway, given that we have 8 minutes left, I presume you guys have already obviously introduced yourselves, and hello everyone in the audience. I'm Greg Ray. I lead the Deloitte Life Science and Healthcare Industry team, and again, apologies for the issues. So panel, thank you for joining. It sounded like you may have covered the first question around the kind of the disrupted value chain. And please nod if that's the case. But in terms of just keeping the conversation going, beyond the disruption, I guess we were talking about vaccines and the future of vaccines. If you haven't already touched on perhaps what the pandemic has taught us in general, just on development and access, that might be an interesting topic to pivot to. But Lovisa, it sounded like perhaps you were addressing some of that.
We did address some of that, and I think we're maybe we're getting towards the point where we're thinking about what impact we believe that the experience of the COVID response may have on adult vaccination and so for the future. And I don't know, Judy, if you...
Yeah. Well, I just, as we talk about the future, I guess a question that I had was, do we recreate our vaccine capabilities to respond to future pandemics? Is this would it be an overreaction to start to build up capacity globally to address the future pandemic, or do we revert to our quote unquote typical endemic mentality? I guess how long lasting do you each see the changes, and whether or not we will actually change from a response standpoint? Is there even a winning strategy from a public health and commercial standpoint?
I can give that a shot. I do think there is a winning strategy, which there's a lot of talk about a warm base, right? So what we really would need the world would need is an ability to quickly ramp up new vaccines at the almost like 12 billion scale we've seen now. I think we can all agree that that's necessary if we want to avoid a similar situation. And the cost, as I argued, is so high for a future pandemic that it is worth the investment. We are seeing countries, we're seeing the EU and others kind of investing heavily in that warm base. And I think the good thing is if we can find production technologies where you can quickly shift over, then that could help finance also vaccines for areas that are not profitable today. So in other words, the country basically invests and pays as an insurance premium for an ongoing vaccine production base. And then while we are waiting for the next pandemic, it is then producing vaccines that are needed but are not profitable today. I think that could be one of the winning strategies. I definitely don't think that we should reduce the vaccine production that's been built up over COVID.
Yeah, I think I would agree. I think we've seen a number of countries invest in their own domestic manufacturing capability so that they don't have to rely on other countries in kind of another pandemic. But I mean, it is definitely a challenge. I mean, scaling up manufacturing to meet demand in a pandemic situation but avoiding a scenario where you have all of this extra and unused capacity and resources lying around in a post-pandemic world. I mean, we have seen, I think, some pretty remarkable innovation within the industry, but also with contract manufacturing organizations, which have enabled kind of that agile and flexible process. And I mean, these organizations, I think, would be critical partners for biotech and pharma companies. And I mean, I do think we'll see, and we've already seen some of those creative collaborations to both ensure supply when needed, but also to kind of smooth that long-term utilization of that capacity.
And I can just add that, I mean, I think this, as we mentioned before, it's preparedness. How can we identify novel outbreaks early on? How can we be ready already with variant-proof vaccines and vaccines in general, so that we can instantly, flatten the curve and prevent the disease from taking hold in the population next time we see an outbreak like this? And I think we will be able to be ready in a much bigger degree than ever before.
But that capacity forecast, if you will, it's going to be a function of, right, we still don't know the durability of from a COVID standpoint, how the current vaccines will fare, and so whether this indeed and hopefully will be will beat all the variants, the existing vaccines out there, or will we be chasing variants, or will there be a new launch every year, or will there be boosters every 12 months? I mean, so still a lot of variability in the system. So, capacity planning and capacity forecasting becomes a bit trickier. But I guess any views that, I think, Rasmus, you mentioned that the calculus has changed now, but I don't know if Judy, how you may think of it from a GSK standpoint.
So sorry, I'm not sure I completely understood what question you were asking.
Yeah, sorry. Just given the we don't know the durability of the existing vaccines, and we don't know whether this will be effective, or whether there'll be a booster required every 12 months, or whether we're going to be chasing variants, every year. How do you gauge what capacity is necessary, since all of that is not known yet?
Yeah, I mean, so it's a balance. I think one of the things we've all gotten really good at is scenario planning, and planning for a couple of different more likely scenarios. You can scenario plan yourself to death, so I don't think that's effective, but certainly looking at what you think could be your top three most likely, and plan for those. I think, I'm not sure who made the point earlier, but I don't think a good strategy is just stockpiling as much as we could possibly ever want. I just don't think that's practical. It's not feasible, and I think most countries can't afford it. I think it's more about how do you build systems and be able to, from a manufacturing standpoint, flex up or flex down as quickly as you can. So I think it's more about building flexibility into the system, and less about like, we're going to have to be able to get it right in order to build to that.
Yeah. Maybe we can pivot then to kind of a broader innovation topic, and vaccines for beyond COVID. Obviously, RSV is in the wings, but other indications, and I think one of you may have said vaccines are having their moment. With other indications, and the amount of investment and certainly contraction of innovation cycles, how do you see that impacting the landscape in general, right? And is there a higher flexibility in terms of that fine tuning, Judy, to your point, just by virtue of the other indications that might be downstream?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned it briefly. I do think that given what we can see from pipelines, you mentioned RSV as one, but there's other, innovation happening along more in the adult vaccine space than in the pediatric space. And I think we're going to have to start thinking through what the implications are of trying to get more recommended vaccines for adults, not just accepted by adults, but how are we going to fit those kind of into a recommended schedule, given kind of flu, the things that already exist, flu, shingles, pneumo, and potentially COVID every year.
Right.
So I do think that there is a combination strategy that you will see coming out from many manufacturers to try to accommodate that kind of crowdedness.
Right.
And so that will be another consideration, I think, in the manufacturing and distribution process of how do you do that? Can you combine? What's the impact of combining, both from an efficacy standpoint, but also a safety standpoint? What's the willingness of consumers to take multiple vaccines at once?
Nell, I know there's VBI's got a number of
adding on to that
assets in the pipeline.
I mean, it would be really interesting to see the impact that COVID-19 has on those other adult vaccinations. And I mean, both with the different kind of innovative platforms, technology, different indications that are going after combination. However we think about it, I mean, there are so many vaccine preventable diseases that persist as substantial public health issues today. And I mean, outside of COVID, I take hepatitis B, for instance, where, I mean, it's pretty well known that the symptoms and complications of Hep B are numerous. The management of them are, and I say management because there is no cure yet, is expensive. And Hep B vaccines have been available since the 1980s. And yet in the US, I mean, only 25% of adults are vaccinated against the disease. 2/3 of people who are chronically infected with Hep B are unaware of their infection status, which obviously increases the likelihood of transmission. And acute infection rates have risen across some of the key age groups and high-risk groups over the last several years. And all of this could be avoided, or at a minimum substantially reduced, with improved vaccination rates. So, I mean, hopefully we'll see, kind of with the innovation in the vaccine space, an uptick in the protection against all of these other vaccine preventable diseases, but also that you'll start to see kind of the general public take ownership or more ownership of their vaccination status, what they have received, what they haven't, where are they exposed, and work with their healthcare providers to ensure that they are well protected against viruses beyond just COVID-19.
Yeah, and I would just add to that as well, I think exactly as Nell and Judy alluded to, and beyond infectious diseases, also many other diseases where vaccines could actually be an extremely powerful preventive medicine, one of the most powerful such, and how we can start thinking about the pre-disease space as well, sort of the room between disease and health, and where vaccines can be a highly impactful treatment paradigm.
And maybe the last question I was going to ask Rasmus, how does that then factor into some of the models that you've been working with, just in terms of the broader capacity modeling, for example?
So I think that the capacity build, as we're seeing, we're not seeing a slowdown in that. And I think we have to, there are like 300 companies that basically moved into the vaccine space during COVID, right? Because it was a major opportunity. A lot of these companies are now looking and say, we're probably not going to, enter the COVID space now. It's kind of too late unless we have a new take on it. So what a lot of these companies are doing is they're pivoting to other areas. They're looking around and then saying, what other infectious disease could we use our technology for? And that's just that's a massive innovation push that we've never seen before in the vaccine space. And it's bound to lead to better vaccines. And then hopefully a lot of the production capacity can then also be flexed over or pivoted over. So it really will be a win-win situation. And I think it is, when you look at the infectious disease, it's just startling how many infectious diseases are out there that we could develop a vaccine for. I think RSV is a good case in point. It has a very, very big toll on children, on elderly, vulnerable. And, we would think that we would be able to find a vaccine for that, which would have huge public health benefits. And I think that's much more likely to happen after COVID than it was before COVID.
Yeah. Well, regrettably, we are out of time. And again, this is probably not the last time we'll be having this kind of a discussion. Thank you for having the moderator-less start to the panel. But I appreciate everyone's thoughts and perspectives, and very much thank you for being part of this. So for others, please join the next session on decentralized clinical trials. Certainly will be a very interesting discussion, and we'll be seeing all of you in the not too distant future. Cheers. Thank you.